to fully respond to that crisis. 5 years after Hoosick Falls, 2.5 million New Yorkers still don't know if there are contaminants in their drinking water that could make them sick. In December 2015, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency sent a letter to the residents of Hoosick Falls telling them that their water was not safe to drink. It had been contaminated by a cancer-causing but unregulated chemical, PFOA. What residents didn't know at the time was that this contamination could have been discovered years earlier. Hoosick Falls is a small community, around 3,000 people. And because of their size, Hoosick Falls was not required by the federal government to test in 2013 for a list of unregulated contaminants in their drinking water, a list that included PFOA. Instead, Hoosick Falls' pollution was discovered later by a village resident who had to test his own tap water after seeing his family and neighbors become sick. The burden of discovering drinking water contamination should never be placed on New Yorkers. Governor Cuomo and the state legislature rightly recognized that New York needed to establish its own process for proactively identifying and responding to unregulated contaminants in drinking water. In 2017, the governor signed the Emerging Contaminant Monitoring Act, which expands testing for unregulated contaminants to all water systems, regardless of size. But for over 3 years now, the governor's Department of Health has acted as if this law just doesn't exist. The Department of Health has not established a list of unregulated contaminants to be tested for, as the law requires. Approximately 2,000 small water systems in New York have still not been tested. And though the Department of Health recently established drinking water standards for 3 toxic chemicals, PFOA, PFOS, and 1,4-dioxane, there are hundreds of unregulated contaminants known to occur in drinking water, including chemicals like strontium, chromium-6, and vanadium that can harm human health. So today, lawmakers, community members, and advocates have come together to say we cannot wait any longer to learn what's in our drinking water. We can't clean up dangerous pollution if we simply don't know where it is. Governor Cuomo must direct his Department of Health to uphold the law. Should delays continue, however, our champions in the state legislature are ready to take action to protect clean water. And I really want to thank all of the speakers for joining us today, especially Senator Skoufis and Assemblymember Gottfried, who carry an important bill to jumpstart drinking water testing in the Senate and the Assembly. They will be our first speakers, followed by Hoosick Falls residents Jennifer Plouffe, Lorene Hackett, and Kathy Dawson. And we will then close the program with other advocates around the state, including Dr. David Bond, a professor at Bennington College, Joe Campbell, a leader of Seneca Lake Guardian, and Brennan Carney, a Dutchess County legislator. So with no further ado, I'll turn it to you, Senator Skoufis, to kick off our program.
Thanks very much. And I'm really delighted to be here with environmental advocates and everyone else who's on the call, including my esteemed colleague, who I miss seeing in the Assembly on a day-to-day basis, Dick Gottfried. And look, you know, this is analogous. The idea that we are only going to protect the drinking water of those New Yorkers who happen to live within a larger water system is analogous to, during COVID, only supplying PPE to large hospitals with over X number of employees or X number of patients. It's analogous to only putting protections in place in those nursing homes that have X number of residents. It is unthinkable that this state, and quite frankly offensive, that this state would stand by and not protect the drinking water of 2.5 million people, many of whom live in the Senate district that I represent, the same way that we protect the drinking water of the approximately other 17 million people that live in New York State. So we are at our wits' end here. We are sick and tired of giving the Department of Health any more rope to get this done. They've had now years. We've been given commitments that have proven empty for years. And Assemblyman Gottfried and I, working with the folks on this call, our legislation in the absence of any action by this Department of Health. And so, look, we return to regular session in a month. It remains to be seen if we get called back up before then. But the Department of Health still has some time to act before our hands are forced to act in the legislature at the start of 2021. We hope we don't have to pass this bill. We don't want to have to pass this bill, but we will pass this bill if the Department of Health continues to ignore the public health and safety of millions of New Yorkers.
Thank you, Senator. And we'll turn it now to Assemblymember Godfrey.
Well, thank you. You know, I suppose sometimes the Cuomo administration feels that we're picking on them. And I suppose we are. But sort of in their defense, I can say I've worked on environmental issues and other issues through actually 8 governors. They all seem to use the same training manual. And part of that training manual apparently says on environmental issues, you drag your feet. And we've seen this at Hoosick Falls. We've seen it with the contamination in the Hudson River. We've seen it with a whole host of things. And that's happening with adding very dangerous contaminants to the list of banned substances in drinking water. And that's why Senator Skoufis and I have a bill that would just say, you know, yeah, we've created a commission within the department to identify toxic substances, and the department should add them to the list. But for crying out loud, it's been years now. And so we've got a bill that would just add a bunch of very dangerous chemicals to that list. Enough is enough waiting for the administration to get to work on this. I don't like having the legislature making scientific judgments that ought to be made by the professionals. But when the professionals are plainly not doing their job, and when the professionals who are outside of government are so clear as to what's needed, then the legislature has to step in. And that's what we plan to do.
Thank you, Assemblymember, and thank you again both for your leadership on this issue. We're very much looking forward to working with you to get that bill passed if it's needed in the next legislative session. So I'll turn it now to Hoosick Falls resident Jennifer Plouffe.
Hi, good morning. Well, I'm happy to say I am happy to be here to continue advocacy on behalf of New York State residents for clean water. I'm also very frustrated to continue to have this conversation. I moved to Hoosick Falls from out of state about 5 years ago, well, exactly 5 years ago. Before I moved, I checked the water supply and was able to take a look at what was out there as far as what was in the water. However, unbeknownst to myself, there was a whole lot of other contaminants that weren't being tested for. So I essentially, within a short order of moving to Hoosick Falls, found myself in the middle of an environmental catastrophe. What we've learned is prevention is key. So how do we prevent this from happening in other communities, especially small rural communities who happen to be ground zero for a lot of these heavy manufacturing industry? There's a lot of pollution in these small communities. It's quite frustrating to know that there's over 2,000 small communities whose water systems have not been tested. Let's test the water for these and other emerging contaminants. 5 years is a long time to be waiting. Imagine the babies that were born in 2005, or excuse me, 2015 are now 5 to 6 years old. If the pandemic has taught us anything, it's that time is precious. How many other children are drinking contaminated water, all because the DOH continues to drag their feet and making sure that public water supplies are regularly tested and monitored for poisons and carcinogens. This bury your head in the sand mentality and what we don't know won't hurt us is fundamentally flawed, and it is a dereliction of duty on the Department of Health's part. What are you afraid of uncovering? Another Hoosick Falls situation, we are the perfect case study of what not to do, but also how to move forward to protect other communities. How many people, children, the elderly, the health compromised, are drinking water that has unsafe levels of industrial and other contaminants that will end up affecting the long-term health for these folks? There's a deep chasm of uncertainty because of what we don't know. This summer, New York State passed MCL levels for emerging contaminants, which was a good first step in regulating and monitoring public water supply systems across New York State. However, we've been left with little progress and actual testing. Does this make sense? In New York State, it is New York State only interested in posturing and serving up platitudes to placate the public. This is how it appears. There are millions of New York State residents who still do not know what's in their water. Is it safe to drink? Due to the Department of Health's failure to implement the Emerging Contaminant Monitoring Act, which the governor signed 3 years ago to ensure all water systems test for unregulated contaminants. As we know, environmental contaminants like PFOA and PFOS and others like them are not only biopersistent, but they are bioaccumulative in the human body. They have a long half-life. Time is of the essence. 3 years have passed since ECMA was signed, and 5 years has passed since the crisis in Hoosick Falls. Have we learned? Nothing. It's time for Governor Cuomo to do his job and instruct the Department of Health to do theirs. This hurry up and wait mentality is unacceptable and putting New York State residents' immediate and long-term health in jeopardy. We need clean water to sustain a healthy life. The Department of Health of all regulatory agencies should understand the importance of protecting the health of our residents. If I did my job the way it appears the governor and DOH is doing theirs, I wouldn't have one. It's time for the governor and Department of Health to stop resting on their laurels and actually show us, prove to us that you care about making sure all residents in New York State have clean and safe drinking water. Talk is cheap. There's no time like the president. Let's get it done.
Thanks, Jennifer, for that really, really powerful statement. And now we're going to turn it to Laureen Hackett.
Good morning. To further contamination concerns, PFAS were reported in pesticides just this week. A bill has passed banning glyphosate only on state lands. While we in Hoosick Falls still search and test for a new water source here, these issues raise more concerns about the areas near waters worth looking at. How confident and informed a choice can we possibly make if we don't have and utilize an updated list of emerging contaminants? We already know all too well the hazards of delay. Regarding PFAS, this past year, air emissions testing results informed our community working group that more unregulated replacement and shorter chain PFAS emissions are still occurring here, which include approximately 20 PFAS in that report, which couldn't even be identified with that particular test. Given all we've learned in the last 5 years alone, via the multitude of health studies of further disturbing toxicity and bioaccumulation of the PFAS class, if we don't even know what they are, it'd be foolish to assume they aren't of concern. What if those 20 are more toxic than PFOA? Where else are they? Studies of the shorter chains, such as C4s, such as PFBA and PFBS, claimed as safer, are illustrating varying harms in development of babies and children at ever lower doses. Several studies have reported that these are eliminated from the blood quicker, yet they also quickly build up in the lungs, clearly a concern with COVID severity in yet another recent study. There are simply too many in the PFAS class, now over 9,000, to regulate them one or two at a time. Without a class approach, regulation will fail to ever establish effective health safeguards of these and other dangerous chemicals.
Thanks, Laureen. And now we'll turn it to our final Hoosick Falls resident, Kathy Dawson.
Good morning, everyone. I don't really have a lot to add to what Laureen and Jennifer has said, but I do know that 5 years is a heck of a long time to wait for any kind of answers. And we've been living basically in limbo. In these last 5 years, I've buried my parents, I've seen neighbors and friends die, I've seen friends get sick, and still we're hanging. We're left with no answers. We're left with occasionally getting mailings or an email update. We, as the citizens, are the ones that have to do all the research and bring these issues to the forefront, and it's just not right. We've been hogtied by COVID, and that's taking center stage now with everything, and it feels like we've been lost in the shuffle of COVID, when your basic human right to clean water and clean air is negated. Every day the air in Hoosick Falls still stinks. It smells like burnt plastic, and that doesn't seem to be a concern to people. We make phone calls, we complain about it, and it's still going on. And it's aggravating.
Thanks, Kathy. And we all on the call certainly feel that frustration. And now turning from residents from Hoosick Falls, we'll start to some of our other advocates around the state and even across the state border. So actually with that, I'll turn it to Dr. David Bond from Bennington College.
Thank you, Robert, and thanks for everyone gathered today for this crucially important issue. I find it both curious and an indictment that we're here in early December, almost 5 years to the date after the first public meeting on PFOA was held in Hoosick Falls. And for those who recall the Hoosick Falls story, residents spent years building a case against PFOA against tremendous headwind. They built that case using, in their own pocketbooks against the sort of suspicions and critiques of state agencies, and really forced the issue of PFOA into public light. This is not supposed to be the way that toxics are regulated. And we have a number of sort of legislation, including this one, that are supposed to sort of shift that responsibility over to state agencies where it should be. Yet in Hoosick Falls, it depended upon the tremendous will of a handful of residents. So jump back 5 years. December 2015, the first public meeting about PFOA is held in Hoosick Falls. What happens at that meeting? On stage, New York State DOH hands out a fairly poorly written and scientifically inaccurate fact sheet that explains to residents that drinking water laden with unregulated but highly toxic chemicals does not pose a risk to their health. In the back of the room, residents hand out EPA reports that show that those same chemicals are highly toxic, and if they're found in drinking water, a tremendous amount of investments need to be made into filtering that water to protect public health. So on one side, New York State DOH turning a blind eye to a toxic problem that is actively assaulting the health of a modest New York State community. On the other side, a small group of committed residents forcing that problem into public light so that something could finally be done about it. That's where we were 5 years ago. Where are we today? How much has changed today? On one hand, quite a bit. After Hoosick Falls, there was a real review process of looking at the lapses that led to Hoosick Falls, of how we could put together a more robust monitoring system to prevent other communities from following what happened to Hoosick Falls. In 2017, Cuomo signed the Emerging Contaminant Monitoring Act, which did just that. It put together a robust monitoring program to test every public drinking water system in the state for emerging contaminants. As we know, there's a number of toxics that the science is clear, they pose a real risk to public health, yet the process of formally listing them as hazardous substances can often take over a decade. So the emerging contaminant list becomes a way of beginning to monitor for these toxins that we know scientifically are a real risk to public health, but the policy hasn't quite caught up to banning or prohibiting them. So in 2017, looking at what happened in Hoosick Falls, the problems there, Cuomo signed into law a plan to fix that, to prevent other communities from falling into what happened in Hoosick Falls. We now have a sensible and science-based plan to protect other New York State communities from toxic chemicals that are leaching into the drinking water. So some things have changed. Yet on the other hand, nothing has changed. Here we are 5 years out from Hoosick Falls, and we're still waiting on DOH to begin to implement that plan. Here we are again, a group of committed citizens and advocacy groups demanding that DOH stop downplaying the threat of toxic chemicals and start doing its job. We have to ask at this point, why is New York State DOH always missing in action when it comes to protecting our communities from toxic chemicals? Who exactly are they serving when they refuse to protect public health around the known risks of emerging contaminants? This agency insubordination, and I think that's the right word for it, insubordination, hits upstate New York particularly hard. Large urban water systems are already required by EPA to monitor their drinking water for emerging contaminants. This EPA requirement, again, which only applies to large cities, only protects roughly 2 out of 5 residents in upstate New York. That is to say, nearly 60% of residents living outside of New York City depend on drinking water systems that are not being monitored for emerging contaminants. New York State residents increasingly live in a world of 2 separate and unequal systems of drinking water protections. Drinking water protections for big cities, which are robust and science-based, and the lack of drinking water protections for everyone else. This is unacceptable. The toxic threats to drinking water have multiplied under the Trump administration. And yet DOH continues to sit on the sidelines, unwilling or unable to do the essential job it was given. For reasons that defy science and stumble towards dereliction of duty, New York State Department of Health refuses to protect the drinking water of rural communities from emerging contaminants. This has to change. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bond. And we'll now be skipping back across the border, actually out to the Finger Lakes region, where Joe Campbell from Seneca Lake Guardian will talk about some of the contamination problems going on near Seneca Lake. Oh, and you're on mute, Joe, just so you know. There we go. All right, you're good. We should be able to hear you now.
Okay, I can't see you.
Oh. I can see you.
All right, well, I'll just go ahead then. As Robert said, I'm Joseph Campbell. I'm the president and co-founder of Seneca Lake Guardian, a Waterkeeper Alliance affiliate. And our mission is to preserve and protect the Finger Lakes region of New York State, especially its clean air and clean water for generations to come. Like many communities in New York, we have identified areas with elevated levels of PFAS chemicals, but with the exception of our own outreach, the Department of Health has kept the public largely in the dark about results. The former Seneca Army Depot is located squarely between Seneca and Cayuga Lakes, which are major sources of drinking water in our region, and where the use of firefighting foam has left plumes of PFAS contamination. In fact, results of testing in one monitoring well showed astronomical levels of almost 93,000 parts per trillion of PFOA and PFOS, far above New York's maximum contaminant level of 10 parts per trillion. The depot is surrounded by farms, wineries, private homes, and many people in the Amish community. The public has a right to know what is going on with emerging contaminants. We had hoped that the Finger Lakes residents would finally learn whether or not these and other toxic chemicals are in their drinking water, and if so, to what degree. However, on the 5th anniversary of Hoosick Falls, and despite the fact that Governor Cuomo signed the Emerging Contaminant Monitoring Act in 2017, the Department of Health has failed to act, and our community remains in the dark. Public water supplies that serve communities surrounding Seneca Lake like Watkins Glen, Monterey Falls, and the town of Hector, where I live, have still not been required to regularly test for a host of emerging contaminants. When a Superfund site is located on the shores of the lake where you get your drinking water, like we do, our government should be vigilant in monitoring for chemicals that could make us sick so that they can keep the public informed and clean up contamination where it's discovered. We call on Governor Cuomo to immediately advise his Department of Health to implement the Emerging Contaminant Act to publicly share all test results on both public and private water supplies in the communities where testing has taken place and to educate residents about potential risks immediately. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. And to kind of continue our focus on, the threat that emerging contaminants pose statewide, we're going to hear now from a Dutchess County legislator who is also going to bring the perspective of local elected officials into the mix here. So we're very excited that Brennan Carney was able to join us today, and I'll turn the floor over to her.
Thank you so much for having me today. This is such important work that we're focusing on today. One of my most important responsibilities as a county legislator is to protect the health of our communities. The public must be able to have the fundamental expectation that when they turn on the tap, the water will be safe to drink. Emerging threats, especially in the form of chemicals from post-industrial activities, clearly jeopardize the health of our local communities. I'm delighted today to be able to thank the local officials in the town and village of Rhinebeck, part of my district, Supervisor Elizabeth Spinzia and Mayor Gary Bassett, who formed the Hudson 7 to protect just a few of the water sources in the Hudson Valley. Their work, along with that of Riverkeeper, is a vital step in protecting water safety at the local level. For example, the city of Poughkeepsie has recently acquired advanced testing equipment and will share that equipment with members of the Hudson 7 to increase testing quality and results. In the spirit of their work and yours, I want to use this opportunity to call for support for parity in resources for our small water supplies. We have over 150 alone in Dutchess County. When contaminants are found in large water sources, such as our city systems, then we can reasonably deduct from that that those same contaminants may be present in our smaller systems. And I want to emphasize that a dual approach of protection at the source and testing is needed to ensure water safety. Today, I call on New York State, especially the Department of Health, to support the ability of smaller communities to test and remediate contaminants in their systems and to protect their systems at their sources. We need unwavering state support to continue to invest in public health by expanding our list of emerging contaminants and funding in the form of grants and other sources available to small communities. State support is vital to our ongoing mission to keep our water safe and pure. Thank you again for all the work you've done, and thank you for having me today.
Thank you again, Brennan. And that brings us to the close of our program. So at this time, I'll turn it over to any press questions. As I mentioned earlier, feel free to post those questions in the chat or raise your virtual hand on Zoom, or feel free to raise your in-person hand if you're on video. We'll pause now for any press questions. I see Marie French has one. So Marie, if you're on the line, feel free to speak up or post it in the chat.
Yeah, hi everybody. Thanks so much for holding this today. I'm excited to see what the council does later today. I guess for Assemblyman Gottfried, I mean, I've heard you speak about this before, that you want to force DOH to take action. You've proposed, some bills to do that. What sort of do you see as their deadline? I mean, obviously regulations would take time. You guys would be going back in January. And then, what support have you gotten from colleagues in terms of being able to pass this smoothly or quickly in the upcoming session?
Okay, in terms of time, it's taken forever. After we passed the law authorizing the department to add chemicals by regulation, that it took forever for them to even get started on that effort. And it just dragged on month after month, year after year, while they kept postponing meeting after meeting without really any valid explanation. And that's why we're now pushing for legislation that would add chemicals to the list. How long might that take? I suppose in theory, we could pass it in early January. When we reconvene, the governor could sign it the next day. I think realistically, the governor's gonna, whenever we pass the bill, the governor's gonna take a long time before he signs or vetoes it. That's what this governor does. And it's gonna take a lot of support from the community, from advocates, from legislators to make this happen sooner. You asked about support from my colleagues. We've got, I'm looking at the list, it looks like we've got about 20 or 30 members of the Assembly co-sponsoring the bill, including the chair of our Environmental Conservation Committee and people from all parts of the state. So I think there's, and Senator Skoufis can talk about his side. I think this is an issue that has a lot of public support that people can readily understand. We all drink water, and I think if we can help the public know that this issue is sitting unresolved in the legislature in Albany, I think there will be strong public demand to get this done.
Thank you. And then I guess just for advocates, we did pass, DOH passed the regulations for PFOA, PFOS, and 1,4-dioxane. There's sort of a timeline for water systems to address those contaminants if they find them. What have you guys heard or seen in terms of the implementation and rollout of that? And do you have any concerns there?
Sure, and maybe I can start this off before turning over to some of my colleagues, but one major MCL exceedance we have seen so far is in Suez water down in Rockland County, a water system serving about 300,000 people down there, reported that they detected about 19 parts per trillion of PFOA in their drinking water. And we've certainly had some concerns with that MCL violation. The first of which is that it appears that Suez, the local county department of health, and by implication, the state department of health, is not being clear with residents about the health risks of these chemicals in their drinking water. So we saw both the local health department and Suez in their public notification reference EPA's health advisory level of 70 parts per trillion for PFOA. In the next sentence, they reference the state's 10 part per trillion maximum contaminant level. And so not only will this introduce kind of tremendous confusion among residents of what level in my drinking water is safe and should I be concerned about, but it's really undermining to the actions that the Drinking Water Quality Council took in their deliberations to determine that actually the EPA health advisory was not the level that we need to be regulating levels here in New York and protecting New Yorkers' drinking water. That's one major concern that we have so far on that kind of communication of the health risks. Maybe I'll turn it over to some of my colleagues for any other concerns we've seen with exceedances.
Hi, this is Liz Moran with NYPIRG. I'd be happy to add to that. So as Rob stated, we're deeply concerned that the department continues to use similar language to what they used, frankly, when these issues started to come to light in New York 5 years ago. It harkens to the messaging that they used in Hoosick Falls. It harkens to the messaging that was used on Long Island. There seems to be a pattern of undermining the health impacts that have been associated with very low levels of exposure to these contaminants. That being said, it's also worth noting that in Rockland County, it was more than just PFOA and PFOS that was detected. I bring this up because advocates had called for the department to establish a combined maximum contaminant level. Many of us called for 2 parts per trillion for PFOA and PFOS because we argued that any combination of these contaminants could be a threat to public health. And the more we learn, the lower that level becomes. That being said, at the time, 2 points were made to us. One was, these 2 chemicals often don't show up together. The other point that was made, at least by some utilities, was, oh, we handle it that way anyway. We will treat this like a combined maximum contaminant level. Rockland County shows that's not the case. We have seen data from Rockland County indicating both PFOA and PFOS are in their drinking water, and those are not the only PFAS contaminants that are in their drinking water. So when you look at all of those PFAS chemicals combined, it's not just a low exceedance of 10 parts per trillion, it's a significant exceedance of 10 parts per trillion. And so the department really needs to consider what can be done about these chemicals as a class.
Thanks. And one additional to that, what about the issue of sort of deferrals of treating water and water systems? I think I've seen at least one news report, maybe down on Long Island, about a water system seeking and getting a deferral. Are you aware of others? You know, how much of that are you seeing if you've been able to get that information?
We are not aware of too many. The Department of Health so far has not put out any public information about water systems that have received a deferral. I believe the deadline to apply for a deferral was just a week or 2 ago, I think around November 24th. So as of November 24th going forward, water systems can no longer apply for and receive a deferral. But the Department of Health has been not forthcoming about that information, and it's really critical to know how long it might take some of these water systems to actually install treatment technology and remediate the water. So we'll continue to push them to release that information. And honestly, it should be part of a release of much broader information. The Department of Health should also be very transparent about the testing data that results from these maximum contaminant levels, and releasing not just the data on PFOA and PFOS to fulfill these MCLs, but the other PFAS detection data the water systems might pick up when they're using these EPA methods that might detect 14 PFAS at a time. Wonderful. Any other questions from press on the line? Okay, hearing none, I think we can call it a wrap. Thank you again to all the speakers for all of the work that you did today and every day to try and secure clean water for all New Yorkers. And we will, of course, be in touch again soon with advocacy going forward. And we will keep you all updated if the Department of Health does take any action on this. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Great job, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you all. Bye,
Thank you,
everyone.
Assemblymember Godfrey, you're awesome.
Thank you very much. You're all terrific.
Thank you, sir.